This is Outrageous History. Hello, I'm Ernest Granson. Welcome to Outrageous History. Architecture, it's all around us, a crucial part of our lives. The practice of architecture has been called a social art and an artful science. Those who practice architecture generally consider what they do as more than just a profession. It's a calling and a passion. When you think of architects and passion, particularly in North America, I'll bet the first person that pops into your head is Frank Lloyd Wright, whose name could be equated with a definition of passion. His life and his work has been the subject of numerous books, articles, documentaries. All of those have attempted to reconcile or at least explain Wright's scandalous life with his architectural genius. Today we have with us Paul Hendrickson, a senior lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania. Paul's book, Plagued by Fire, The Dreams and Furies of Frank Lloyd Wright, goes deep into trying to interpret what led to this passionate and highly eccentric life. Thank you for being with us today, Paul.
Thank you for having me, sir.
Paul, maybe to begin with, take us through the timeline and the highlights of Frank Lloyd Wright's life, maybe briefly. And then also, can you explain to us the significance of the title of your book, Plagued by Fire?
Those are two important and big questions. I wonder if I can contain myself so that we can have some back and forthing here. But first of all, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you to the listeners tuning in. I like very much what you just said in your introduction. Architecture, it's all around us. It's like the air that we breathe, in a sense. The built landscape. Wright in his ego, and it was a gargantuan ego, would have said and did say that it was the mother of all arts. And I think you could argue that, but I think there's certainly truth there. Every great civilization wants and needs to have a representation of itself on the world stage, and it reflects itself through its built environment. So Wright did a mighty contribution of that. I also liked what you said, Ernest, that you say architecture, and it's almost like a word association game. Frank Lloyd Wright, those three words might pop instantly into your mind. In a sense, he was one of the original crossover artists. He got himself up out of architecture to become a cultural phenomenon, like Elvis. He became more than architecture. He became more than the sum of his parts. Simon and Garfunkel wrote a tune, So Long, Frank Lloyd Wright. He conquered television in the 50s. So he became, in his little pork pie hat and his hickory cane and his swagger and his black cape, he became, not unlike Hemingway, whom I struggled with in a previous book, became a cultural, iconographic figure in our history. I will resist in this entire episode reading from my own book, except I would like here at the outset, if you would allow me, to read about 12 lines, because I think they encapsulate what you asked.
Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Well, first of all, he was born 2 years after the end of the Civil War, and he died not quite 2 years after the launch of Sputnik. That's 91 years and 10 months on the earth. One of his grandsons said, he embodied within himself an entire century. It's pretty much true. 91 years and 10 months on the earth. But here are these 12 lines or so. In a 72-year career as an architect and an egoist, Frank Lloyd Wright shook more than 1,100 things out of his sleeve, a staggering number by any artistic measurement. They were churches, schools, offices, banks, museums, hotels, medical clinics, an automobile showroom, a synagogue, a mile-high skyscraper, and one exotic-looking Phillips 66 gas station in Cloquet, Minnesota. Overwhelmingly, though, they were houses, residences, shelters for mankind. Not quite half of all his drawings and designs and studies were realized. So about half of those 1,100, and about 400 still magically come up out of the American ground looking for the light. Falling Water near Pittsburgh, the Guggenheim on Fifth Avenue, the Johnson Wax Building in Racine, Wisconsin, Unity Temple in Oak Park, Illinois, the Roby House on the campus of the University of Chicago, to cite just 5 masterworks by their vernacular names. So the range of this man, one of the things we'll talk about here today, I'm sure, is the amount of fire and devastation and destruction in Wright's life. The demons that he had to conquer are as staggering a monument as his architectural masterpieces. His greatest home, Taliesin, it's how in the Wisconsin hillside, burned to the ground in 1914. And there was a horrible murder, multiple murders associated with that. That tragedy, 1914, you write an entire book just about that. It burned down again in 1925. It nearly burned down a third time. There were fires, and not just there at Taliesin, all throughout his life. Very late in his life, when his last child, his 7th child, and not by his first marriage, was getting married in a Chicago church. Her name was Giovanna. He's an old man by now, in his 80s. He's in his white ice cream suit. The wedding is being conducted at a church designed by Louis Sullivan, who was Wright's mentor, on the near northwest side of Chicago. The priest, with the brazier of coals and incense, is going around the bride and groom with the incense and got it too close to her veil. And her veil caught on fire, causing all of his apprentices and fellows who were in attendance, standing in a semicircle, to rush forward and beat out the fire. At which point, 15 minutes later, the ceremony was able to continue. And here, at the back of the church, pacing back and forth with his cane along a wall, is this old man whose name is Frank Lloyd Wright, who's the father of the bride, muttering to himself and shaking his head. All my life, I've been plagued by fire. All my life, I've been plagued by fire. Ernest, I fought mightily and lost with the editor, copy editor, salesman of Knopf, my wonderful publisher, to have this book entitled with that full quote and to put it in quotes. I wanted the book entitled, All My Life, I've Been Plagued by Fire. And they fought me down. They said, it's too long. We got to shorten it. Take the quotes out. We'll make it Plagued by Fire. I still wish I had won. But man, this was a guy who was plagued by fire. Take my word for it.
Well, let's go back just before that very first instance of fire, which was so traumatic. and which garnered so much attention. You mentioned even in his beginning, the beginning of his career or prior to his career, that he liked to mix up his histories, his words. Especially he did this in his autobiographies. I think we had two. One was a revision, but you spoke about his story of arriving in Chicago as a young man, and you had his version, and then some of the research that you uncovered showed that he, liked to change his own history.
You are being so generous to the old boy. Oh my gosh. He was a prevaricator of world-class standing. I said in the book that his autobiography, it's called an autobiography, is one of the greatest autobiographies of the 20th century, and yet you have to mistrust it on every page. You have to mistrust it practically in every sentence, or at least every paragraph. Oh, he would distort, he would manipulate, he would outrageously make things up. We don't have 3 hours here for me to start listing it. So I was amused when you said that the true story of how he came to Chicago from his home in Madison, Wisconsin, to start conquering the world as an architectural apprentice, that he fudged that story a little. Oh my goodness, did he fudge that story a little? He did. When we were talking, so I did my best. I did my best to set the record straight. And the entire book is a way of that I wrote of trying my damnedest to set the record straight. But I think historians and biographers will continue setting it straight for the next 100 years. I think I added a few contributions. Again, circling the themes we're talking about already here, this man went through so many artistic periods. It's why he's so famous. He had more, it seems like he had more periods than Picasso. It's not quite true. But his first great period were the prairie houses, those great, stretched out, linear masterpieces on the Midwestern plain, especially in Illinois. And the greatest assortment of them all is in Oak Park, Illinois, which was not his hometown. It was Madison, Wisconsin. But Oak Park was where he lived after he got married when he came to Chicago. My God, you can go up and down the streets of Oak Park and see these Frank Lloyd Wright great horizontal spread outs of the prairie house. That's only one period. That period lasted roughly from 1900 to 1909. And he builds these prairie houses that draw Wright worshipers from around the globe. He wanted his prairie houses to what? Replicate the flatness of the American earth in the Midwest, what we might call the flyovers. People want to get from the East Coast to the West Coast, and the Midwest is this ugly thing. Not to Frank Lloyd Wright, it was where he grew up. And he said, I will make my houses come up out of the ground as if they are growing up out of the ground. And I will have them mirror the expanse of the land itself. So there was something essentially democratic. It's almost manifest destiny going from east to west with these houses. I grew up, Ernest, myself, 50 miles below Chicago, in a small downstate town, barely downstate, 50 miles below Chicago, Kankakee. And there was a Frank Lloyd Wright prairie house built in 1900, a precursor really to all the great prairie houses, on the same street that I lived on.
And were you aware of that as a young boy, that it was a Frank Lloyd Wright house?
Is spectacular. You asked me about the title. Do you want me to say that now, or do you want to ask another question?
No, I think I'm really curious about that, and I think our listeners are too. Just for the fact that it is so significant in this biography.
Can I tell you the story?
Of course.
I'm 9 years old, and Santa has left under the tree at 230 South Harrison Street, where we lived, in a modest house up toward town, up toward the retail district. Santa has left under the tree a maroon-colored J.C. Higgins 3-speed bicycle. And when the snows melted a few months later, I'm sailing down South Harrison because it slopes downward. And if you get 5 blocks down to the very end of South Harrison, on the same street that I live on, we were inherently middle class. 5 blocks down was this immense thing called the B. Harley Bradley House. Now, I am hyperbolizing a little, but not too much, because I'm on my bicycle and I've got my Spalding baseball glove hooked to the handlebars of my bike, and I'm headed toward Riverview Park. What was then known as Riverview Park, today it's called Cobb Park, where the baseball fields were. And I kind of screeched to a stop. What is that? Because it looks like nothing else in our town. Now, would I say that I had never been aware of that house before? Well, probably I was, but I was acutely aware of it when I had the freedom of my 9-year-old self on my J.C. Higgins 3-speed. Ernest, I'm a very slow learner. So it only took 6 decades for that epiphany-like, stopping me in my tracks experience to loop around and find me as a writing project. But it did.
And so was it that epiphany that led you to this book eventually?
I think, here's my theory about book writing. We don't find our book projects, they find us. I think something got implanted at 9 years old. Now, my pea brain could not understand what was going on in that house. And in fact, so any listeners here, for their own edification, might be interested in just Googling the B, as in the initial B, Harley, Harley, Bradley House, Kankakee, Illinois. And what you will see, although no photograph can capture it, you have to be standing in front of it, leaning on the handlebars of your J.C. Higgins 3-speed and having this jaw-dropping epiphany to really get the sense of this east-west, actually it was north-south, stretch out. This house is impossibly long, impossibly wide. No photograph can quite catch it, except here is a phenomenally interesting thing. This house, I said, was the precursor to all the prairie houses. 1900. He was still working it out in his brain, what he was trying to do. So even though the house stretches out incredibly, in the middle of the house, there's a gable. There's a high-peaked gable. It was as if he was still tortured. He was still tortured between verticality and horizontality. And he was still working it out. And it wouldn't really be worked out until the first true prairie, a couple of years later, up in a suburb closer to Chicago in Highland Park, Illinois. But the B. Harley Bradley is the St. John the Baptist house. It's the precursing forerunner house, and I'm just proud enough to claim it as my own in Kankakee, Illinois. And yes, to answer your question, I have to think the book was born there. And I'm 77 years old, and I've written 7 books, and that's the most recent one, published 2 years ago. Damn, I'm a slow learner, but I did it. I was able to catch it. It came around. It found me. I dreamed my way into the story.
Well, it's such a unique biography, and that's what really attracted me, is that it was not a what you call a linear type of timeline. You came back time and time again to connect a whole bunch of different pieces in that were taking place in Wright's life.
Thank you for saying that. And and I'll contain my answer short here, but just to respond to that, I don't know how to write a linear book. I don't know how to write a cradle to grave book. I don't have the psychic energy to do that. What I seem to be able to do sometimes is pick out pockets in a storytelling life and to trombone with them, to go in and out with them, and eventually try to connect all the dots. Do I succeed? I do not. Sometimes, half the time. And indeed, to be modest, why not be a little humble here if I sounded like I'm blowing my horn? So many critics, to my consternation, surprise, humility, jumped on this book as opposed to the previous one, Ernest Hemingway, in which I was employing the precise same methodology. But yes, I'm writing a book right now about my father in World War II and his night fighter squadron on Iwo Jima. And that also is a storytelling pocketbook, because, Ernest, I believe that no human life proceeds in a straight line, but rather, like jazz, it has its own inner logic. And so I go on tangents and I go in and out, and you've heard them even here in this podcast.
Now, speaking of fathers, here is one piece of the puzzle that you really made a point of talking about, and that is Wright's father, who it would seem to me was a major figure in his life, in Wright's life. It's like he's the pivotal character in Wright's life. We found that out about 3/4 of the way through the book. So you devoted a lot of commentary to him, talking about his basically dysfunctional marriage with his wife Anna, Wright's mother, but also his unsatisfactory career as a preacher and a musician. Did this lead to an ambiguous kind of relationship with his father, and did it contribute to Wright's personality and the different decisions that he made through his life?
Well, you're right on the money, and the father's name was William Carey Wright, and the parents divorced in 1885. And Wright sided with his mother. And when he wrote his autobiography, he, by pernicious implication, made it absolutely seem as if his father was to blame, when in fact, it was precisely opposite. The mother drove the father from the home. The father sued the mother for abandonment and divorce. He was the plaintiff, she was the defendant. Wright knew what he did. He never saw his father again, supposedly, after that 1885 breakup. And he was haunted by it for the rest of his life. There's so many internal haunts in Frank Lloyd Wright. This is what makes him an appealing figure. I mean, the artistic brilliance is unquestioned. It's staggering. The degree to which, though, he's a haunted figure, I feel, has not been looked at. He knew what he did. William Carey Wright, his father, was a failed man, was an intensely talented man in about 7 or 8 different ways. As a preacher, as you said, as a musician, composer, as a lawyer, as a tinkerer, and even an inventor, and all kinds of talents that were never quite realized. A tiny little man, that's where Wright gets his small stature, whose imposing wife, ex-wife, eventually towered over him. This man wandered after the divorce, kind of from one failure to another, and ended very, very sadly. And I wrote 2 very long chapters called The Sad Ballad of William Carey Wright, Part 1 and Part 2. The father is an incredibly alluring figure, and Wright, yes, he got so many things from his mother, not least his drive, his ambition, but he couldn't have been Frank Lloyd Wright. The world wouldn't have had Frank Lloyd Wright, and I don't mean biologically, obviously, if the father, William Carey Wright, had not existed with all of his talents and gifts that were never quite able to be fully realized. The way I like to think of it, Ernest, if there had been 1/2 turn of the screw, then maybe Frank Lloyd Wright's father would have been Frank Lloyd Wright. But as he was, he's a man lost to history. He's a man lost to history. And I tried in my small way to bring him back to the page. I'm certainly not the first, and I'm certainly not the first to have recognized his importance. I don't want to suggest that in the least. Nor am I the first to have set the record straight about the divorce. But I tried to bring it out in a more stark reality.
Well, I'm thinking when you wrote that Wright did visit his father's grave, and it's possible that he recognized some of that relationship, however he viewed it. But I'm wondering if that has something to do with how Wright seemed to be he almost seemed to jealously relish himself as an outsider. Did that have any relationship with his father?
Yeah, that's an insightful question. Yeah, he sided with his mother, and supposedly, the family spurned the father. Yet, why did Wright make these quiet and, in fact, mostly in secret pilgrimages to his father's grave in rural Wisconsin? And I picture him standing there with his hat in his hand. And in some way, there's no record of this at all. There's some oral history of one of his apprentices who drove him there once, but doesn't, what did Wright say at his father's grave? Even if he said nothing, the fact that he went. But I dream myself into the image of him standing there with his hat in his hand and saying, "Father, I'm sorry." He would never acknowledge that in his own life. But if you read between the lines of the autobiography, you get the longing. You get the longing for the Father. You absolutely do. As for the outsider question, yeah, Wright regarded himself always as the outsider. And he was not accepted by the architectural establishment for many periods of his life. Why? He was too radical. He was too brilliant. He was too threatening. He relished his outsiderness.
In the last period of his life and of his architectural career, there was some criticism about some of the designs that he came up with in the late 1950s. Did his philosophies of architecture change that much during those decades?
Again, it's a very good question, and thank you. Thank you for all the good questions here. An artist has to grow and change. Wright's late period is very controversial. Yes, we have the Guggenheim, but isn't the Guggenheim the strangest looking thing? What is that? A flying saucer that is set down on the Upper East Side? What is it? An upside down washing machine? What is that thing called the Guggenheim? There's a famous New Yorker cartoon where two people are in an open-topped car outside of the Guggenheim. It's a drawing, a cartoon, when they're building it. And the wife turns to the husband and said, are they allowed to do that? But the Guggenheim. And doesn't the Guggenheim is an amazing building, and yet, to me, it's not an amazing building for art. It's an amazing building for Frank Lloyd Wright. It's as if he said, "Oh, I want my building to be greater than the masterpieces of canvas hanging on the walls." It's a spiral, and you work yourself downward from the top. But I think he wanted to build the greatest piece of art in the museum, which was the building itself. But there are other late 50s works that are highly controversial and indeed can be thought of as garish. But an artist has to grow. And if they're not my favorite Wright pieces, like those magnificent prairies, like the little Usonian houses. These are, if the prairie house was the great stretch out house for the wealthy man, expressing maybe a democratic principle of manifest destiny, nonetheless, it was for wealthy people. His Usonians, he invented that term, were these little jewel boxes built for every man. They were the everyman's prairie. They had all of these magnificent touches, and they also were spread out, but they were tiny things. He wanted to build them for $5,000. He built his first one for about that. The Jacobs, the Herbert Jacobs house in Madison, which is I invite the listeners, the readers, the listeners here to Google the Usonian Herbert Jacobs. It's the everyman prairie. But he went through all of these changes. And on the one hand, I would say more power to him and all praise to him for being willing to try something new. And on the other hand, some of it looks like stuff out of the Jetsons. Buzz Corbett, Space Cadet. Yes.
Well, there's just so many aspects that we could touch on in his life, which, I mean, you can't really fully discuss all those parts of his life. But one thing that, before we wrap up here, that I do want to ask you is, he seemed to recognize that he was a flawed man, but that didn't really stop him from following along his flawed path.
Absolutely.
What do you think it was about his personality that allowed him to indulge in his beliefs about his own genius and his outrageous behavior?
Well, good question again. It was his ego. It was the belief that he could flaunt morals, and yet he's a product of these, on his mother's side, these pious Welsh minister forebears. That's how he was raised. That stuff never left him. So he's flouting it, even as he's haunted by it and feeling guilty about it. And going back to what I said about the father, and this is what makes him so appealing to me. You know, people have him wrong who suggests that he's just the insufferable egotist. Yes, he is. In the way that Hemingway is the endless macho man with the bare chest hunting big game and pulling in marlin. Yes, that part of Hemingway is true. And underneath all that with Hemingway is a bookish man in glasses trying to get his work done. And under all this with Frank Lloyd Wright, under all of this little cock-strutting ego in his black cape and his pork pie hat, is this man who felt things at the deepest level. And I leave you with what I feel is a self-evident proposition on that point, namely this. I think what you have to do is scrape away with Wright all the dross and refuse of the ego and the arrogance. Oh my God, he defines the word ego, he defines the word arrogance. But the self-evident proposition is this. If you do not have at base a fundamental soulfulness, how would it be possible to build Unity Temple in Oak Park, the Johnson Wax headquarters in Racine, put the Guggenheim in Manhattan there, put Taliesin for sure, his home on his ancestral hillside in Wisconsin? You cannot create that kind of art if you do not have a fundamental soulfulness, and I would say decency. You know what I said about Hemingway? And I'll take a chance and say it about Wright. He was on some kind of strange search for his sainthood, which he betrayed at every stop and turn.
Well, I would have to say that anybody who would take a tour of these houses and buildings would have to agree that there is some soul in there. If you can look for it, you would have to agree that he was searching for his soul as well. So, Paul, I thank you so much for showing us the many sides, the puzzling sides and the outrageous sides of Frank Lloyd Wright, and also how the work has influenced our idea of buildings and the places in which we live. So I thank you so much for doing this today.
He's not going anywhere, but I'm going somewhere. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
And I thank all of you for tuning into Outrageous History. We'll see you again soon. Outrageous History is produced by Northern Flicker Media.